Hey everybody, this is Rydo and we're back to the beginner's guide. Let's continue. So we're just in a bright white area in these more desperate vertical slice demos of garbage games. Thinking about Coda, in particular, and what we've seen about him and the way he's being described by the narrator, it at a certain level almost feels justifiable that if Coda really was the person who thought of the Stanley Parable, or at least maybe the main gimmick or one of the gimmicks in the Stanley Parable, if you get away from the idea of copyright and capitalism and owning your own creations so much, so as though most people would say you should probably own your own creations for at least some amount of time, but even in capitalist countries like the United States, copyright really only says you own your creation for 70 years past the death of the creator at most, and then it becomes public domain, because there is a balance you're trying to achieve between benefiting an individual who is creative and benefiting society with those creations. Because if you create something and then just hide it away or use it to profit only yourself, then the general populace suffers too much from that. When you start to understand those concepts, or even think about those concepts, and maybe not even really understand them, there's almost a justification by the narrator to steal the ideas, if he did steal ideas from Coda. Because Coda obviously will never put them out in any kind of finished form. Like, at a certain level, stealing is not the right term. Sharing, borrowing, when code is put out in programming for other people's uses under certain licenses, nobody thinks of that as stealing code. People really only think of stealing code as if you copy someone's code without their permission. And there's frankly a lot more code sharing out there than there is code stealing. So yeah, there's almost a justification here. Now, of course, the danger in this is that we are being sold one person's perspective, the narrator's perspective of what happened, Coda's perspective of what happened, and what actually happened that an objective observer might have seen could be completely different, assuming there is a Coda at all in the game. Let's go with what is this? This looks nice. Audio is glitching. How did I get here? Hello, is anyone there? Where did the silence come from? If we're following the idea of Coda being desperate, let's go with hello, is anyone there? Again, I question whether the source engine can even really do a good job rendering these games. Although I also kind of question if there's an easy way or any way to really port source engine games to something like the Unity engine or the Unreal engine. Is that a person? How lovely. It's been a long time since I talked to anyone. ... What's wrong? You look lost. Coda is definitely depicted as kind of a person who thinks all of his creations should be centered around the idea of a specific idea, when you really don't need that in games. You can say, hey, I want to make just a generic first-person shooter shooting zombies, and then I just want to polish that generic idea to an excellent level and sell it and make a great game. What is the gimmick on something like Dying Light or Dead Island? To start off with, Dead Island is just zombies on a resort island. That's not that unique. It's a game that has RPG elements and customizable weapons, upgradable skills, very basic things you'd see in lots of games. Dying Light is the spiritual successor to Dead Island. It gets rid of the resort island concept and it really is just about zombies in the generic areas, cities, countrysides, things like that. It has parkour elements which were popular when Dying Light started to be developed. Just a lot of taking general concepts of zombies, which have always been fairly popular in games. First person shooting actually in Dead Island and Dying Light does exist, but it's not even really the main attack. More often you are doing a hack and slash attack with bats and knives and things like that. RPG elements have been around forever. Upgradable skills, upgradable weapons, all very generic concepts. You don't have to get into a crazy narrative. Almost every zombie game doesn't bother to get into any kind of crazy narrative as far as where the zombie virus would have come from and who created it and all of that. It just doesn't matter. Also, one thing that struck me, as I'm not really interacting with this game, even though it is pretty. Of course, it could just be this is a single tree Coda made or a single tree Coda bought and grass, but we haven't been seeing grass and trees in Coda's work. If anything, that would almost imply Coda sees nature and trees as a negative thing, as an emptiness that he should pave over with his ideas, with his flat cement walls and his wooden doors and his locked in tunnel like areas. But yeah, what we don't see here as far as Coda learning anything, if Coda really is a real person, we never see him make like Pong or tic-tac-toe or solitaire game. If you were being educated, you'd probably be asked to program those real quick. Even doing game jams, you would have been asked to do that. You would have been pushed to potentially use some of the smaller, more specialized engines out there. Like there's a very easy solitaire game engine out there that leads to a lot of easily made, quickly made solitaire games. Not Klondike Solitaire per se, but card matching games that flood Steam, or used to flood Steam. They're not so bad nowadays. But yeah, almost every programmer should program something simplistic like Pong, the first electronic video game ever made. Just for historical reference, they should have programmed something like Minesweeper or Tic-Tac-Toe. Anything that would have taken a simplistic board game. We've never seen a dice roll or a random function implemented really in his game. Closest we saw was that Labyrinth. He's trying to run before he learns to walk in a lot of ways, and that is certainly the danger, the real world danger of having powerful engines like the Source engine or Unreal or Unity, is that people try to run before they can walk. They don't understand to the fullest amount or to a level they should, the underlying text and code that you're just going to have to encode into a game, and the math and functions and physics that you're going to have to implement in a game. They think it's much closer to something like playing with Lego than it is, say, carving something out of stone. That is in particular one reason why I don't really like the Scratch programming language, which is a visual Lego-like programming language for little kids to learn programming, but it inherently teaches the message that you will always have a drag and drop visual interface to program things, when that's just not the case. The step up from something like Scratch to Python is a giant leap, because Python is 100% text based, like most programming languages are. And Python is designed to be a fairly easy text-based language, but it's not particularly the most efficient. You're going to, at the core of it, have to become an expert in programming specifically with C, C++, more likely, or C#. It's very possible C#, but you probably should start with C++. You're not going to get anywhere as of 2022 learning, say, Java, or JavaScript really won't help you much in video game programming either. Python may help you a little bit, but you're not going to make a game in Python that is actually released. If you're going to be a 3D animator, at the core of it, you're going to have to probably learn Adobe Photoshop and Adobe 3D modeling in maybe something like, I think it's called Mira is the name of the software, or Mira, Maja, something like that. But anything you do at a high level as far as 3D modeling is then going to go into the engine, the Unreal engine, the Unity engine, any C++, C# code you put in there. That is what you are going to then merge into the engine, and then have a final product start to be developed in Unreal. So the engines themselves require the understanding of how gasoline works, to use a comparison. Let's go with I'm completely out of ideas. Interesting. I may be glitched here. Yeah, I couldn't get off the rocks. It's funny how this is what Coda thinks being completely out of ideas is, because emulating what you see, emulating trees, emulating nature is kind of a great way to learn in 3D modeling. Although inherently just copying nature alone won't be considered very creative. It'd be funny almost if Coda was a false personality. Not so much just in this game, but in the real world. If some internet troll kid said, I'm gonna make 25 games over the course of, I think it was somewhere around 5 years, and troll people, and then at the end of it I'm gonna show myself or depict myself as getting increasingly crazy and depressed and alone, just to get people to be concerned about me and care about me. That would be an interesting persona to put out there. At a certain level, that almost screams that if you even had that thought and were willing to commit 5 years to playing a role, that there probably is something mentally wrong with you to do something that Andy Kaufman-esque and that crazy. There was a machine that kept me going and it stopped. I was trying to find this engine that used to protect me and start it again. Let's go with 1. If this was the first game from Coda, the narrative... I'm not really reading this, am I? Wait, you're looking for a machine? I think I know what it is. It isn't far. If this was his first game, I wouldn't like the narrative around it, certainly. That you're out of ideas on your first game. If this was your second or third game, I'd be okay with that. Visually and audio-wise, at least you're doing something that looks a lot better and is more relatable. Although, really, you still have a very small effort here. I need to see it, I need to know why it stopped, I'll pick. Like, this still really is just asset flips. I see floating islands in the sky games all the time, but
If the last game featured Coda talking explicitly about his creative frustrations, this one turns it up to 11. Now, put yourself in my shoes playing this. Here's a friend whose work is exhibiting signs of struggle, frustration, anxiety, depression, even. And yet, still, he keeps making games. He keeps throwing himself into the grinder even when he clearly doesn't have the energy for it anymore. Why? What is it for?
I feel like even his first game showed that, though. Maybe not so much that first game, but the fact that the first game wasn't finished definitely shows that. And that none of these games are anywhere close to being finished. If anything, this is more of a meta-narrative on how the narrator is not a good friend and has blindly missed, whether he wanted to be a good friend or not, the anxiety and depression that the Coda had from the beginning. I can take you to it, but there's a problem. It's guarded by a difficult puzzle. If you can solve the puzzle, we'll find the machine deal. I guess I can say it doesn't matter what I say, does it? We're going to end up there one way or another, right? Yeah. Even when I do see floating island games though on Steam, they are actual attempts at games. You would run or jump or parkour or fling yourself from floating island to floating island to touch some kind of crystal, some coin, something that would be your goal. There would be timers, there might be enemies, there's a chance to fall to your death and reset at a checkpoint or just lose completely. It's not just the floating island aspect. Generally, when I see floating island games, I know that it's probably a pretty low effort game because you're just trying to avoid having to make natural barriers or invisible walls. So you create the most natural barrier, which is just a fall to your death. He said deal, even though I picked number 3. And I assume that this puzzle is going to just be the same door puzzle. We're now seeing smaller trees. There's a notorious middleware software called SpeedTree that literally just fills areas with randomly generated trees. So it's super, super easy if you're using something like SpeedTree to get a tree into your world. Now, when you want to start tweaking things and making trees look a certain way, you still have to kind of do that more manually. So I imagine those giant trees over there are not just an easy flip of a button for SpeedTree, where these smaller trees are probably fairly easy. But you don't even really have to use something like SpeedTree. You could almost certainly just buy a tree 3D model from something like the Unity asset store. Again, I don't feel like there is a Source Engine asset store though, or even a place where people would share their Source Engine creations that much. Which continuously pushes me to think that this is not a Source Engine game. And that we've stopped seeing Source Engines. Perfect. Come along, I'll show it to you. And then here we have more variety of Asian influence, obviously. This almost feels like this is a game made by a completely different person. Which, that might be the case. Maybe Coda really is more like the Dread Pirate Roberts, where the name gets passed on
at the time
to different people.
What I knew of him, this was a result of how isolated he was. He was in his own little bubble, just sitting at his computer all day, not really showing these games to anyone, not releasing them onto the internet, and so he didn't have anyone outside of himself to connect with. He had no outlet to ground himself on.
I probably was supposed to be walking when I got to that point. Yeah, so according to the narrator, he never released any of these games on the internet. He wasn't showing them to anybody. I still heavily suspect that Coda really is just the narrator. But at a certain level, I can't even disagree with not releasing these on the internet. Maybe he should have put the first game online, just to get criticism. It would be ridiculous for a video game critic to say video game critics could possibly help a game creator. In fact, my main guidance to video game creators is to never listen to critics, because we're really only designed to give consumer advice to consumers, not creators. That's the purpose of my criticism in the way I frame it always. But that being said, had that first game come out and had he been given encouragement in some aspects and discouragement in several other aspects, it may have guided him to become better and improve, because I just don't feel like Coda has improved. I feel like the technology has improved. I feel like the using of other people's creations and asset flipping has improved. But the actual story and interaction is exactly the same, pretty much. You really have to start nitpicking and going and saying, like, well, now this has a dialogue choice option in the games, and that's pretty much it. Maybe the very first game didn't have you pressing the use button to open a door, and so you had the toggle to switch open door technology. But you're saying over 5 years then that he created 2 iterations of a dialogue system, maybe 3 iterations of a dialogue system that's still not great, and a door flipping switch. A switch that on a door that you can flip. That's not a lot of progress. And I try to entertain the thought, certainly, that maybe Coda might be an excellent accountant or something else, that he was really successful at something else, but I can't really imagine, if Coda actually existed, that he would be doing anything to a successful level and having the free time to do these games and not realize how useless and bad the games are and waste of his time. So I imagine Coda as being this on welfare, mentally disabled person, shut in, agoraphobic maybe even, that's just living in his bedroom. Or Coda could potentially be working in a game industry as a low-level developer that is really just probably hired to do busy work and maybe just bug check or do QA, and so he gets the work done, but he's not doing anything creative and not really doing the real work as far as creating things. It would make a lot of sense that Coda would be working as some low-level QA tester or low-level programmer, debugger. Debugger makes a lot of sense in that maybe he's not supposed to create anything, or maybe he's just supposed to place trees or assets and textures and walls or level design and nothing else. But that would give Coda the access to the software to some level to be able to program, and the computers and hardware is necessary to program. At a certain level, it is, if you go back to 2009, like, you would have to have a decent computer to even make the games that he was making. But if you were shut in, you potentially would have a decent computer. So you stop getting this curve and the splits on the rails here, and it just becomes stretched out, either meaning that this is flat or that this is just going to go on forever. Oh. What do you think? Hey, I recognize this. I solved this puzzle before. This is easy. Maybe there is an overemphasis in which Coda thinks everything should be easy. I totally get that feeling that he thinks everything should be easy, and that the world should be easy, and his life and interacting with people should be easy, and it just isn't. So he may be living this fantastical thought in his video games that everything should be as easy as just flipping a switch, when no, it'd be fairly boring if game development was this easy. Like, if anything, that's the problem with so many bad games on Steam, is that it has become a little too easy to make games. People aren't having to put their passion into it. It's not a matter of hours. It's not blood or sweat or tears, really. It's just passion. That if you have to have a passion, if you have to really struggle a little bit to make something run and be in a sellable state, then you will make a better product. Wine, if you could make wine chemically in a day, probably would not be as good, although that's a matter of chemistry. I would assume wine wouldn't be as good if you could make it in a day compared to having to grow it on vines, grow grapes on vines, and then turn it into wine through a laborious process. There is definitely a potential future, though, that you might just be able to put a brain scanner on your head and scan your ideas and make amazing games. But then the standard of what is good would be raised to a very high level. There is that old colloquialism, nothing good comes easy. And that's something I think Coda never really cared to learn. Even looking at the store, there's visually some improvements, but there is, at its core, still no real improvements at all. It's still a Switch. Let's do the dialogue. Hey, I recognize this. Oh, wonderful. Can you tell me how to do it? First, you have to open the door. Okay, now what? Now you have to close the first door. Now you've closed the first door. Alright, what's next? It's all being done for me. Now you press the switch here. Huh. That was so simple.
Talk yourself out of loneliness. It doesn't work that way. You can't be the one writing both the questions and the answers. Then there's no movement. Then there's no circulation. If all of your anxieties are being channeled into your work, then if the work ever fails, you have no backup and you're just going to crash.
The narrator's right. I would agree with that, certainly. One of the fallacies many people with mental problems have is that they can just solve it all themselves. But obviously, if you could solve it all yourself, you wouldn't have the mental problems in the first place. Inherently, humans do have to rely on other people. The use button, by the way, does not work on the Switch. Tech says, I can't believe I never solved it before this. But yeah, you are going to need that external influence to potentially improve. And you can get that in many different ways. The standard way would be to see a psychologist, a trained, certified, professional person. There is also even danger in that because there are psychotherapists, and that's what I meant to say, was psychotherapists, that have gone to college, and then there are people that pretend to be psychotherapists that are not qualified and not trained, and you have to kind of do the research, and I can't even tell you which one is which, but in particular I know that there are people out there that portray themselves as being qualified to help people with their mental problems, and they don't. Generally speaking, if you're talking to a counselor that was recommended by like a religious organization, or that is working through a religious organization, there's a high chance that they don't really have the qualifications, or that they got their qualifications from a church sponsored school, religion sponsored school, that's not looking at it from as much a scientific perspective, and is instead starting with the answers they want to preach and then teaching the counselors how to get to those answers. But outside of psychotherapists, friends certainly could be that outside influence. Friends, even enemies, even just colleagues, just random people could give you an outside influence and perhaps help. Also, the internet in general, the internet's not really a great place to communicate. It would have been better in 2009 than 2022, but if Coda had just been on some forum somewhere, posting his games and getting feedback and talking to people and just creating relationships there on the internet, that would have almost certainly helped him. Even if he wasn't posting, even if he was just kind of trolling and listening to people, other people talk, or just looking at other people's codes and what other people were doing, just having that outside influence, that randomness of new thoughts and new ideas coming from outside, that would have helped him a lot too. At the very least, Coda could have stolen some ideas, which, yeah, if Coda does have a good idea in anything he ever made, which I still have yet to really see it, his ideas being stolen may be as valid of a thing to happen as him stealing other people's ideas. And so we've got a different kind of archway here, and then it feels like we're going to eventually curve back. Yep. It would almost feel like it would be more poetic to go through the door and for this entire back half of this side of the door to be an exact mirror, or just the exact same thing on the other side, because that feels like that's a statement, whereas I don't feel like this is the statement. Now, it does seem like it's keeping all the text of what we've said. So I said, I'm completely out of ideas. Hello, is anyone there? What is this? I need to see it to know why it stopped. Deal. Hey, I recognize this. There was a machine that kept me going, and it stopped. Although that was one statement that they've merged into two kind of shapes. Deal would have always been there no matter what. This is perhaps an interesting experiment in him having procedurally generated text show up, but you could also pre-render each of the responses, so there weren't that many dialogue responses. And again, I don't feel like this is that amazing of an idea. To just throw your dialogue choices back at you. Now, if you were to say look at the original Walking Dead Telltale game, if you'd taken the entirety of all of the prompt dialogue and the response dialogue in Telltale, and if you'd saved it in a save file, like a PDF, and then given that PDF to the player to say, this is specifically your story in a readable book-like fashion, that would be pretty cool. And then you could certainly take screenshots of what was happening at the time that each of those dialogue choices were made. That might be a cool little third gameplay mechanic feature. It's not going to do much for most people, certainly, but yeah, it would be a little nice value add. Here, I don't see a value add in this. Like, when you start to think about how would this be scaled up if this was a true vertical slice of a game, how would you scale up having a bunch of islands, a bridge, a single puzzle, and then have all the dialogue choices depicted to you at the end? It's not until you get to something like the horror, I can't even call it a point and click game, it's a keyboard only game. There's a horror game called The Cat Lady, and near the end of the second act of The Cat Lady, I believe it was the second act, you are directly confronted by a character who claims you weren't paying attention to the game up until that point, and that you don't know her name, or where she went to college, what she graduated from, what her boyfriend's name is, things like that. Those may not be the exact questions. And being a horror game, it's like she's threatening to jump off a roof and kill herself if you don't know the right answers. And if you get it wrong, she will jump off the roof and kill herself. If you get it right, she won't. When you get to that level of extreme, maybe then, and only then, paying attention to what the other, the non-playable character says, and responding correctly there, that's when it starts to have impact. Notably, in Coda's games, we have no humans. We have really barely NPCs. They're just people with boxes on their heads. But notice how the Cat Lady, for it to be even memorable in my head, had to take it to an extreme life or death scenario to have the dialogue really matter. Otherwise, it doesn't usually matter that much. Even in something like Mass Effect, where the dialogue kind of matters a lot, you're not so... I can't quote a section where talking your way out of a single fight led to a giant different ending other than the end of Mass Effect 3, and people hated that, where you're basically given 3 dialogue choices and it gives you a different ending that's only very slightly different based on which dialogue choice you use. I think generally nobody has done it very well. Or at least not enough people have done it very well for dialogue to matter, if that's what this is supposed to imply. Okay, here we are. What are you talking about? There's no machine here. These are just some words on some walls. And here we have somebody either having trouble breathing or crying. Oh, the sound is backwards. The little white parts here, I find that kind of interesting. But I imagine it's more of a visual glitch. These are some words on walls, and we'll go with that. Trust me, you'll see. You have to say that your work is fun and easy. You have to say that game development is simple and joyous, and that you love it 100% of the time. See, this almost feels like this character, and this is just a white wall now, is complaining about being a game developer who had some level of success and interaction, and was talking to people like on Twitter, people who have no idea how difficult game development really is. That would be that would make a lot more sense to me, because you do see some level of that, although not really a lot nowadays. More than anything, you have people, game developers, really pointing out that it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to make games, maybe overemphasizing that compared to other careers. There's definitely more difficult jobs out there than being a game developer. But I could see somebody feeling like they maybe needed to say making games was easy to their peers, but even then at that, I don't feel like that's the case. Crunch culture is way more prevalent, to my understanding, than any other kinds of culture. So a almost narcissistic culture to say that game development is easy would be kind of ridiculous. It almost feels like someone's being choked to death. We really don't have any choice here, so let's go with number 2. Says you have to say that your work is fun and easy, so we'll go specifically and directly with easy. Sure, I'm making games is easy. That feels wonderful. That seems to be breaking out of this box. Why did the walls just crumble? Why do I feel awful why did it feel so awful when I said that? Well, I'll go with but it wasn't true. Don't worry about it, just keep talking. Keeps saying creation is easy. When I make games, I feel completely energized. When I'm constantly excited, enthusiastic. I am constantly excited and enthusiastic about my work. It is easy, it never stops being easy. In a lot of ways, this seems very much just the same idea as what the teacher was saying. This door, still same size. The words have moved further out, by the way, less claustrophobic. Yes, there was a world stamped. I get it, that's a weird thing to say to someone you just met. There are just words on the wall. No, I don't remember having to go through any puzzle. Some of these words feel like they are from feel like they were choices from previous chapters of the game. I could see seeing a bad therapist to get back on that thought and having them tell you just fake it until you make it, because that's really what the concept that's being applied here is. And I know we're going long today, and yeah, fake it till you make it is not healthy at all. It's not really talking about your emotions, your needs, your wants, your desires. It's just saying suppress all of that to make other people comfortable. And it's promising a lie that faking it will make you happy. And that's just not true at all. A qualified therapist might say there are times when perhaps you should fake it, but those should be very limited times. Like if you're at a party and you're feeling a little sad, maybe you still smile and be friendly to everybody, but you don't do that day in, day out, every day. You don't lie to yourself about that. You recognize that you're doing a very normal human thing of pretending and lying to get through a social interaction, which is very, very common. You're not lying to yourself, you're lying to others. It's fairly healthy and normal to lie to others. It's not helpful to lie to yourself. Yourself is about the only person you should always be honest with. Let's see. The easiest, it never stops easy.
Seeing
Yes.
this game at the time that he made it, it looked really unhealthy to me.
Yes, that's wonderful. Keep going.
I hated it. I hated seeing him so trapped. It's like video games are not worth this amount of suffering.
I mean, he's not wrong that Coda should give up. Particularly when he's just making video games and giving it to nobody. Like, he's completely disconnected around the idea of... There's no switch or anything here. Like, he's completely obsessed around the idea of making games for the existence of video games existing, and not understanding that video games, like any form of art, only have meaning if it is shared with some sentient being. You wouldn't make video games for ants, or the video games that we see as video games for ants. You might make some kind of thing that's like a video game for an ant if an ant could understand it. But creation for creation's sake is not a good thing. It's better to even assume that you're making video games simply for your own mental health because you can't get the ideas out of your head otherwise, if it's just a fun little pastime. And that's fine. I've written story, drawn pictures, done all kinds of things that really just never get shown to anybody, and most people have done that, but you have to recognize that's what you're doing, and you have to stop when it stops being fun. World stamped with whiteness. Yeah, these are definitely prompts and solutions that I put into other parts of the game. Yes, it's that's wonderful. Keep going. Every time I make something, I feel better about myself. Just never stop creating and you'll never feel bad. It's such a simple solution. Let's go with that one. Yep.
This is someone I really cared about. And I used to get so much joy out of seeing him create.
I don't know why he would. For him to suddenly
become angry and frustrated like this, it was the worst thing for me.
And here we have very different lines of dialogue. The narrator is honestly more of a character I would like to delve deep into his understanding and his perspective, because that's the perspective I don't understand. I don't know why you would put your time into this person and his creations unless you had some like deep friendship for some other reason already, or a family relationship, something that forced you to be near this person and interact with this person. Yeah, I could see maybe the narrator working at the same game studio as Coda, and Coda being this low-level debugger or low-level programmer, and him somehow being the only person that the narrator really liked or could stand. None of this is helping. Please, where is the machine? I'm gonna vomit. Let's go with none of this is helping. Patience, you have to trust me. I promise this will work. Please continue. Pain breezes effortlessly off of me. Any sacrifice made for my work are worth it 100% of the time. It always pays off eventually. Yeah, it's important certainly in any project to realize that it doesn't always pay off. So, yeah. This blind optimism. I think particularly kids are taught, in maybe just in America, maybe around the world, to have an insane level of blind optimism. And you do that to build up their confidence, certainly, but sometimes the message gets too heavy-handed and people do just assume they're going to succeed at everything. If anything, a little bit of negativity in the United States these days is probably good for kids, because everybody is being told that they can be video game programmers, that they're going to work in some kind of science, technology, engineering, mathematics field, and that they're all going to be these scientists and these great creators and successful people and famous people that become billionaires or YouTube celebrities. or Instagram models or things like that, and it's just not true. There's going to be a lot of people that in the future either don't have jobs at all or have very boring, bland jobs and very boring, bland lives in general. There's not a lot of preaching towards having kids and just having a family and living a normal life.
I don't know. This is what I felt at the time.
Yes, more. Keep going.
To explain it. I wanted it to stop more than anything. I had never felt so rotten. I needed more than I had ever needed anything for this to stop.
Yeah. This might be the point where the narrator is breaking down again and betraying that he is Coda. It would make a lot of sense for Coda to be the personification of an old version of the narrator that he doesn't even really understand or recognize. Coda does kind of feel more like he is more of a emotional person at some level at this point than thinking logically. I feel like he probably was more emotional than you would realize from the beginning, because that's where you would get that desire that for games to be easy and successful, and that's where you would get somebody just abandoning a game like his first game and moving on to something completely different, and abandoning that and moving on to something different. I feel like they probably should have programmed you to actually do some video game criticism instead of just narrative criticism. They probably should have programmed you to stand right here and lock your eyes like this and not let you turn left and right, because you're not benefiting anything from that. And there is one scene that they want you to see, and it's probably something closer to this. There's no shame, no film, fear, no guilt. I will be saved by my work. I believe this. Unquestionably, I am a vessel for certainty. We'll pick number 3. Incredible. That's it. I'm free. I'm free. See, now would be the time that you'd let them walk, or you'd have a scripted scene. And here we have the woman crying, although they've been saying Coda this whole time.
But it didn't stop. After finishing this one, Coda takes another 7 months and comes up with a new game.
What's interesting is that was an actual female body model, instead of just a gray-toned character with a square over their head. We're still very much just doing variations on the theme, though. So if we're back to the prison with the furniture and just seeing that again, then any thought that the house with the cleaning was the new world that Coda had moved to and moved out of being entrapped doesn't seem to be accurate. Although it wouldn't be incredibly unbelievable for Coda to have been, if Coda was a real person, which I have to say pretty much every time here, it wouldn't be that weird for him to move out, be very excited and happy about moving out, and then for that to all fall apart, and then him moving back into whatever house he was in before, and just being back into that depression. Although it could very well be that there were actually no physical moves whatsoever, and it is just different states of mind, being bipolar, having a manic episode and being very happy, and then having a depressive episode and being very sad. Having depressive episodes might explain the lack of quality of these games where you're barely able to accomplish anything. That would explain quite a bit. The crying woman, though, as a symbol, I don't know what that means, and I don't know if we're even going to get told what that means. But it obviously, at least in this game, is being highlighted as something that is important and something to see and focus. It is an odd, counterintuitive depiction, certainly. Almost approaching just pure nonsense, where the game is telling you just lie and say everything is easy, just lie and fake it until you make it, and that will free somebody that you were talking to in the game, while really making the player character suffer and revealing an imprisoned crying woman. So that all of a sudden creates three parties, where games up until this point really have only involved two parties. And the games up until this point really have not centered around the idea of the player character interacting on an emotional level with any of the characters. It's just been clean this, clean that, or answer this question, or answer that, or say this thing and say that. Yeah. Anyways, we've gone an hour long, so I don't want to make this any longer. I'm really shocked that the game has really managed to be this long, when in a lot of ways it is kind of nothing. I almost have to applaud the beginner's guide as a game and a narrative, because it has managed to take what is effectively a walking simulator and put some level of intrigue or interest and narrative around it, enough to really let the player play for a lot longer than they really should. Like, had the narrative and the narrator been missing, and had we just been shown these games alone, we should have gotten bored and asked for a refund in less than 2 hours. Whereas they've tricked us effectively to actually play through a bunch of bad games for a lot longer. And that's applaudable, certainly, because the bad games, I lean towards believing that they are totally made up and not real, and that they never existed in the real world at all. That if anything, they were game jam games that somebody made that don't matter, and we're not seeing Coda's real output of actually good, successful games. We're only seeing the failures and the garbage things that were abandoned fairly quickly. If that was the case, then 7 months between the development of one game and another game may have been 7 months of working on something like the Stanley Parable, and actually having good productive output on the Stanley Parable, and then having, in that 7-month gap, a few weekends to make a garbage game on the side. And I keep calling these garbage games, but, well, I guess I'll talk about that story in the next recording, since we're wrapping up here. That's going to be it for this recording. As always, I ask you to like, share, subscribe, comment, and watch every second of my videos. If you want a friend or follow me on any social media sites, there's a bunch of links down below. And if you want to support me further, there's a link to Patreon, or you can friend me on Steam and gift me a game off my wishlist. Thank you for watching. Have a good evening.